The library at Renfield had never been so quiet, and the Duke of Renfield stood in the middle of it with a letter in his hand that he had read 4 times without understanding a word of it, and said hoarsely, "Eleanor, wait, I am listening." And his wife, who had loved him for 7 years in a silence he had never once troubled to break, turned in the doorway with her travelling cloak already fastened at her throat, and said the thing that would follow him into every empty room of that house for the rest of his life. "Yes, Julian, you are listening now. You are hearing me now, at last, because the words are leaving. And if you have ever loved someone who looked straight through you, if you have ever said something true and watched it land on nobody, then you already know why she did not raise her voice even then, and you are going to want to hear what happened next. Before we go back to the beginning, do something small for me. Press subscribe, because what this quiet Duchess did over the following hour is worth watching all the way to the end. Leave a like if you believe the people who are never listened to are the ones who see everything. And tell me in the comments what city you are listening from. And answer me this while you are there. Would you have stayed 1 more year, or would you have walked out that door? Because 7 years earlier, in the assembly rooms of a northern market town, this same woman had fallen in love with this same man over a single sentence. And to understand the goodbye, you must first understand the sentence. Eleanor Marlowe was 16 the winter she met Julian Ashford, and she was the plainest dressed girl in the room by the deliberate choice of a father who believed that a banker's daughter who dressed above her station invited comment. Josiah Marlowe of York was rich in the way that made county families borrow from him and cut him at the races, and his daughter had been raised on arithmetic, charity visits and the harp, in the belief that a woman should have 1 skill for her mind, 1 for her conscience, and 1 for her drawing room. At that assembly she had been standing by the window through 2 dances, being not quite seen, when a girl of her own age, sweeping past on a young officer's arm, caught her hem on Eleanor's slipper, stumbled, and said, loudly enough for the nearest 20 people, that some persons had no business at a gentleman's assembly if they could not manage to keep their feet out of the way. The laughter that followed was small and quick and worse than a slap, and it was into that laughter that a young man detached himself from a group of his own kind, crossed the floor, bowed to Eleanor as though she were the only person present, and said, in a clear, untroubled voice, "I beg your pardon. The fault was entirely the lady's, who was not looking where she walked. And I hope you will allow me to make up for it by asking you to dance." His name was Julian Ashford. He was 20, the heir to a dukedom, and he had done it as easily as another man might pick up a dropped glove, which is to say without effort, without calculation, and, as she would understand much later, without particular thought. They danced twice. He talked about horses and about his father's failing health, and she listened and asked 1 question about the drainage of the Renfield levels that made him laugh in surprise and say that she was the first girl in the county to have any notion what a duke actually did all day. Then the evening ended and he went south, and Eleanor Marlowe went home and lay awake. And something took root in her that night that 7 years of neglect could not entirely kill. It is a dangerous thing, in a life with very little kindness in it, to be shown a little. You build a cathedral out of it. She was 23 when the offer came, and it came the way such things come, through attorneys. The old Duke had died, leaving Renfield beautiful and encumbered, and the new Duke at 27 needed money the way the roof of the Abbey wing needed lead. And Josiah Marlowe had money, and wanted, for his only child, a title that would put her forever beyond the reach of every county family who had ever cut him. There was no pretence about it on either side. What no one on either side knew, because Eleanor told nobody, was that when her father laid the proposal before her and began, gruffly, to explain that she should not feel obliged, she had already said yes in her heart before he finished the sentence. Because she had kept the memory of that assembly room for 7 years, the way you keep a pressed flower in a book, and she believed, God help her, that she was being given the chance to marry the one man in England who had ever crossed a room for her. She married him in the spring, in the chapel at Renfield, with the leads still missing from the Abbey roof, and her father weeping openly in the front pew. And on the night of her wedding, sitting before the glass while her maid took down her hair, Eleanor Ashford, Duchess of Renfield, made herself one promise, that she would never trouble him with her feelings, that she would be useful and quiet and easy to live with, and that she would love him enough for both of them until he came to love her back. She kept the first 3 of those promises for 7 years. The 4th was not hers to keep. The pattern of the marriage established itself so gently that she was 2 years inside it before she understood it was a pattern and not a beginning. Julian was never cruel. That was the thing she would try, later, to explain to people who wanted a villain and could never quite make them understand. He did not shout at her, or mock her, or forbid her anything. He was pleasant at breakfast, generous with her allowance, and courteous in company, and when she came into a room he would look up and smile and say, "Ah, Eleanor," in the tone of a man noting the arrival of good weather, and then return to whatever had his attention. It was simply that nothing she said ever seemed to arrive. She would tell him at dinner that the Webbs' youngest had been ill, and that she had sent for the surgeon at her own expense, and he would say, that's right, and ask the butler about the port. She would say, on a Tuesday, that she thought the north chimneys wanted looking at before winter, and hear nothing more of it. And in November a chimney fire in the servants' passage would take out a ceiling, and Julian would stand in the wreckage, saying that someone really ought to have warned him. 3 times in the first year she wrote him letters when he was in London, 4 pages each, full of the estate and the village and the small, careful jokes she had saved up for him. And 3 times she received in reply a note of 11 lines about a horse. She kept those notes, not out of bitterness. She kept them because they were his handwriting, and because a woman who is starved will save even a crust. The music room told the whole story if anyone had ever gone looking. It was on the first floor at the end of the south passage, and in it stood the harp her father had bought her when she was 12, and for 7 years she played it there almost every evening between 6 and 7 o'clock, and in 7 years the Duke of Renfield never once came in. Not to listen, not to interrupt, she knew, because she listened for his step in the passage the way other women listen for a child's cry, every evening for 7 years, and it never stopped outside that door. Once, at a dinner in their 2nd year, a guest happened to ask his Grace whether the Duchess was musical, and Julian had said, with perfect ease, "Do you know, I believe she plays a little." And the guest had glanced at Eleanor, and Eleanor had smiled and said that she did, a little, and something in her chest had folded itself smaller and gone quiet. And the dinner had continued, and nobody at that table had heard the smallest sound. He did not hear her. That was the whole of it, and it was not one wound but 10,000, and each one on its own so small that to speak of it would have made her ridiculous. So she stopped speaking of it, and built, instead, a kingdom out of everything he did not look at. She took the estate books, because Crane's summaries irritated her, and the underlying accounts did not, and within 3 years she knew Renfield better than any living soul. Every lease, every drain, every arrears. She restored the village school, which had been a damp room with 11 children in it, and made it a good dry building with a proper schoolmistress, Miss Finch, and 41 children, and paid Miss Finch's salary out of her own pin money, and never mentioned it to her husband, because she had learned the exact size of the answer she would receive. She walked the tenancies. She sat with Mrs. Webb through a difficult labour when the surgeon was 3 hours away. She learned the names of every child in the parish and their birthdays, and she was, in that quiet, unmarked way, the most beloved woman in that valley and the least noticed woman in her own house. Below stairs they knew. Mrs. Pratt, the housekeeper, knew, who had served the old Duchess and had opinions she voiced only to the linen. Betsy, the little maid Eleanor had taken on at 14 when the girl's mother died, knew and would sometimes, hanging up her mistress's evening gowns, catch herself crying without quite knowing why. Once, in the 4th year, Mrs. Pratt had gone so far as to say, at the door of the music-room after a particularly long evening's playing, that it was a great pity his Grace was so much away, and Eleanor had answered, without turning round, that his Grace had a great deal to attend to, and Mrs. Pratt had said, "Yes, your Grace," and gone downstairs and told the cook that in 40 years of service she had never seen a woman work so hard at making excuses for a man, and that it would end badly, because such things always did. She was right, but not in the way she meant, because it was not another woman that finally broke the 7 years' silence. Lady Sybil Marchmont came later and did her damage, and there is a great deal to say about her. But what actually killed Eleanor's love was smaller and more ordinary than a mistress, and it happened in the 5th year, on an ordinary Thursday, when the Duchess of Renfield went to her husband with a folded sheet of paper in her hand and a discovery in her mouth that would have saved him everything, and he patted her hand, and told her not to trouble her head, and did not hear a word she said. Mr. Tobias Crane had been the Duke's man of business since the old Duke's time, and he was the most reassuring man in 3 counties. He was 50, soft-voiced, and slightly stooped from the desk, and he had a way of saying, "Leave it with me, your Grace," that made problems seem to dissolve on contact. He handled the rents, the mortgages, the London bankers, the tradesmen's accounts, and the Duke's private debts, and he presented, each quarter, a summary of the estate's position on 2 sheets of paper written in a hand as clear as print. Julian had never once looked behind those 2 sheets. Eleanor had, from the 1st year, not from suspicion but from interest, and for 4 years she had found nothing worse than an old-fashioned system, and a tendency to round figures upward. Then, in the 5th year, sorting the Michaelmas receipts against the rent book to settle a dispute over the Webbs' arrears, she found that the Webbs were not in arrears at all. They had paid in cash at the audit day, and the rent book said so in the under-agent's own hand, and Crane's summary said they owed £11. It was a small thing, She checked the next farm, and the next, and by candlelight that evening she had found 9 tenancies where the money recorded as received in the rent book did not match the money recorded as received in the summary, and the difference across those 9 was £240 in 1 quarter. £240 a quarter is nearly 1,000 a year. She sat with that for a night and a day, checking herself twice, because she was a banker's daughter and knew what an accusation costs. Then she folded her working into a single sheet, went to her husband's study on the Thursday morning, and said, "Julian, I must speak to you about Crane." He was reading the racing calendar. He looked up with the pleasant, unfocused warmth she knew better than her own face, and she laid the paper on the desk and explained it, plainly, in 4 minutes. The rent book, the summaries, the 9 tenancies, the £240, and finished by saying that she did not accuse Mr. Crane of anything, that there might be an explanation, but that she believed the estate accounts ought to be examined by somebody from outside the house. Julian Ashford looked at the paper without picking it up. Then he reached across and patted her hand where it lay on the desk twice, the way one gentles a nervous horse, and said, "My dear, you have been shut up in this house too long with those books. Crane has managed my family's affairs since before you were introduced. Leave it with him. It is what he is for." And he smiled at her with real affection and turned back to the racing calendar, and Eleanor stood there for a moment with her hand still on the desk, and then said, "Of course," and picked up her paper and went out. She did not cry. She went to the music room and played for an hour and a half, and what she understood, somewhere in that hour, was not that her husband thought her stupid. It was that her husband had no opinion of her mind at all, because he had never once looked at it, and that she could set fire to the house and he would ask, pleasantly, whether she had considered that fires were hot. That autumn they went to London, and London gave the silence a face. Lady Sybil Marchmont was 31, widowed, beautiful in the way that photographs badly and enchants in candlelight, and possessed of the rarest social talent there is, which is the ability to make a man feel that he is the most interesting person she has ever been obliged to endure a dull party with. She collected the fashionable and the titled, and in that autumn she collected the Duke of Renfield, and did it so publicly and so lightly that nobody could say a word against it, because there was nothing to see. Only a duke who was at Lady Sybil's every evening, and at his wife's side almost never. Eleanor was received in that circle as one receives a coat left behind by a previous guest. Sybil was never once rude to her. She was worse than rude. She was kind, in the specialized way that flays. She would say, across a supper table, "Oh, do let us ask the Duchess. She is so wonderfully practical about things like drains." And the table would laugh, and Julian would laugh too, easily, without malice, without even understanding that he had been handed a knife and had used it. Twice that season Eleanor tried again about Crane. The second time was at their own table, before 8 guests, and she got as far as saying that she had continued to look into the estate accounts and had found the discrepancy growing, when Julian said, with a smile at his guests, "My wife imagines herself a clerk, and Crane assures me the woman has been at his ledgers again." And the table laughed, and Lady Sybil said, "How charming! So few of us are useful." And Eleanor sat perfectly still with her wineglass in her hand and felt the last small warm thing inside her go out like a wick pinched between two fingers. She did not speak of Crane again. She began, instead, that same night, to write things down. There is a particular kind of quiet that comes after the last hope has been put down, and it is not sadness. It is more like the silence in a workshop when the machine that has been running badly for years finally stops. Eleanor came back from that London season changed in a way nobody in the house could name. She was as gentle as ever, as busy as ever, but she had stopped listening for a step in the passage outside the music room, and she had stopped saving up small jokes for a man who would not hear them, and she had begun, in a plain ledger bought in the village for 1 shilling and 6pence, to keep a second set of the Renfield accounts in her own hand, kept honestly, entry by entry, against the day when somebody would want to know the truth. She did not yet know who that somebody would be. She wrote it anyway. That was the winter of the ring. Julian had gone up to town in February and had come back with a small case from a Bond Street jeweller, and Betsy, who had seen it in the hall among the luggage, had been unable to keep her face straight for 2 days, and Eleanor, despite everything, had felt the traitorous old flutter start up under her ribs, because he had never in 7 years brought her back anything at all. The case was still in his dressing room on the 3rd day. On the 4th it was gone, and on the Friday of that week Lady Sybil Marchmont came down to Renfield for a shooting party, wearing a sapphire the size of a thumbnail set round with diamonds, and told the whole table, laughing, that it was a wicked extravagance, and that she had let a dear friend bully her into accepting it. Nobody looked at the Duchess. Eleanor passed the salt and asked the gamekeeper's opinion of the weather, and was, as always, perfectly composed, and that night she wrote in her plain ledger the date and the words, "A sapphire ring, Bond Street case, brought into this house on the 11th, and drew a line beneath it, because it was not the loss of a ring, it was an entry in an account, and she had decided that the account would one day be presented. The spring brought Mr. Adam Sinclair. The Abbey wing had been failing for 30 years, water in the undercroft, the great east wall bowing, and Julian, who could not bear to look at it, had at last been shamed into action by a neighbour's remark at a dinner, and had written to a firm in Leeds for an engineer, and had then gone to Newmarket for 6 weeks, leaving the whole business, as he left every business, to be dealt with by whoever was there. The whoever was Eleanor. Sinclair arrived on a wet Tuesday in a brown coat, with a leather case of instruments and mud to the knee, and the first thing he did was decline the offer of the housekeeper's parlour and ask whether he might see the drains. He was perhaps 34, unremarkable to look at, brown-haired, square-handed, with a north country flatness in his vowels and an unhurried way of standing still while he thought. Eleanor took him down to the Undercroft herself with a lantern, because nobody else in the house knew where the old culverts ran, and explained, as they went, the 4 separate systems that had been laid there since the 15th century, and which of them she believed had collapsed, and why the water always rose in the north corner first. And Adam Sinclair stopped, and set down his lantern and said, "Forgive me, Your Grace, would you say that again about the north corner?" She said it again, and he took out a notebook and wrote it down, and then he said the sentence that undid 7 years of careful numbness, and he said it without the smallest ceremony, as a workman states a fact about a wall. That is the answer. I should have taken a fortnight to find that, and you have handed it to me in the first 10 minutes. May I ask what else you know that nobody in this house has bothered to ask you?" Eleanor stood in the dark of the undercroft, with the lantern light moving on the wet stone, and could not, for a moment, produce a single word. Not because the compliment was extravagant, it was not. It was the driest possible statement of a professional fact. Because a man had repeated her own words back to her to be certain he had understood them, and no one had done that in 7 years. She said, at last, that she knew a great deal, Mr. Sinclair, and that she would be glad to be useful, and they went up out of the dark together. And she went to her room and sat on the edge of the bed with her hands in her lap and shook, quietly, for about a minute, the way people do when a limb they had believed dead begins to hurt again. The Abbey works ran from April to October, and they were the happiest 6 months of Eleanor Ashford's life, and she was careful the whole time to understand exactly what they were and what they were not. She did not fall into a romance. She fell into being taken seriously, which for a starved woman is a far more dangerous country. Every morning at 8 she walked down to the Abbey wing with her own drawings under her arm, and Sinclair would spread his beside hers on a trestle table in the cloister, and they would work. He asked her opinion and then argued with it, which no one had ever done. He handed her his rule and let her take the levels herself. When she proposed carrying the new culvert wide of the chapter house on the strength of a 15th century plan she had found in the muniment room, he spent 2 days proving her wrong, brought her the proof, and then said cheerfully that she had been wrong for excellent reasons, and that he had learned 2 things from her error, and Eleanor laughed out loud in the cloister. And Betsy, passing with the tea, went back to the kitchen and reported that her Grace had laughed, and Mrs. Pratt said, well, as the summer went on, the work spilled over into the rest of the estate, because Sinclair, who could not look at a broken thing without wanting to know why it broke, began asking about the levels and the drainage rates. And the drainage rates led to the tenancies, and the tenancies led, inevitably, to the accounts. Eleanor hesitated for a week. Then, on a hot evening in July, she brought down the plain shilling ledger and laid it on the trestle table and said, "Before you look at this, Mr. Sinclair, you should know that it may make your position here impossible, and that I will not think less of you if you decline to open it." He opened it. He read for 40 minutes without a word while the light went orange across the cloister, and then he closed it and looked up and said, "Quietly, Your Grace, how long have you known?" 5 years, she said. He said, "And you told him?" "Twice," she said. He was silent for a while. Then he said, "I have worked for a great many gentlemen. In my experience, a man who will not hear a thing twice will not hear it a third time. He will hear it once, at the very end, when it is being read aloud in a room he cannot leave. If you mean to make that happen, you cannot do it as a wife. A wife's complaint is called jealousy, and it dies in the room where it is spoken. You must do it as a case." "Then teach me to build one," she said. He did. That was the summer the Duchess of Renfield learned the difference between knowing a thing and being able to prove it, and it was the education her father had begun and her marriage had interrupted. Sinclair taught her what an auditor requires, that every allegation must rest on 2 independent papers, that a copy is worth nothing without the sworn word of the man who made the original. that dates matter more than sums, and that the strongest case in England is the one a stranger with no interest can walk from end to end without ever needing to trust anybody's memory. And so they built it. The underagent, Mr. Hollis, who had suspected for years and had a wife and 4 children and had therefore said nothing, wept with relief when the Duchess finally asked him a direct question and gave her his own rent books going back 9 years. Mrs. Pratt produced, from the bottom of the linen press, the household books Crane had ordered destroyed at the last audit. Miss Finch at the school, who had a beautiful clear hand and an evening free, copied. The Webbs and 11 other tenant families gave signed statements of every payment they had made in cash on audit day, with dates, in their own words. And through a Leeds attorney of Sinclair's acquaintance, letters went quietly to the London bank and to the firm that held the Renfield mortgage, and it was those letters, in September, that turned a case of embezzlement into something a great deal worse. Meanwhile, and this was the strangest part, Eleanor came back to life in ways that had nothing to do with ledgers. She began to play the harp again in the evenings, and to have the school children up to the house on Saturday afternoons to hear her, 41 of them sitting on the music room floor with their boots off, and the sound going out of the open windows across the park where no one in the family had ever cared to hear it. She wrote again. She wrote to her father's old friends, and once, in August, standing at the trestle table with the drawings weighted down against the wind, she caught Adam Sinclair looking at her with an expression she recognized instantly, because it was the expression she had worn for 7 years at the door of an empty music room, and she looked away, and he looked away, and neither of them said one word. Because the work was not finished, and because there was a duke, however absent, who had a right to the silence between them until she had ended things honestly, and both of them knew it. The letters from London came back in the last week of September, and Eleanor read them standing up in the muniment room and then had to sit down. The first was from the bank. Over 7 years, sums totalling rather more than £9,000 had been drawn on the Renfield account by Mr. Tobias Crane under the Duke's general authority, and paid, in tranches, to accounts that the bank, when pressed by an attorney's letter, was willing to describe as being held for the benefit of Crane's own nominees. £9,000, not the 1,000 a year she had found. Or not only. The rent skimming had been the small change of it. The sweepings. The second letter was worse, and it took her 3 readings to accept it, because it stated, with a clerk's flat courtesy, that the mortgage over the Renfield home farm and the Abbey lands, executed 4 years previously in the sum of £22,000, was held not by the Leeds bank Julian believed held it, but by a private syndicate, and that the syndicate's instructing agent and the beneficial holder of the greater part of it was Mr. Tobias Crane. He had not merely been robbing the estate, he had been using the estate's own blood money to buy the estate's own debt, so that when the moment came, and Crane would choose the moment, the man who could foreclose on Renfield and take the Abbey lands, the home farm, the village, and the school with them, would be the soft-voiced fellow who had stood at the old Duke's graveside with his hat over his heart. And there was a third thing which Eleanor found herself, and which explained everything that had puzzled her for 2 years. Among the papers Mrs. Pratt had rescued was a bundle of Crane's own memoranda, and in the margin of one, in his clear print-like hand, was a note of a payment of £600, dated the previous spring, entered against the name Marchmont. Sinclair traced it through his Leeds attorney in a fortnight. Lady Sybil Marchmont, widow of Curzon Street, had debts of £11,000 contracted at cards and in the shops, and every one of those debts had been quietly bought up over 3 years by the syndicate, which is to say by Tobias Crane, who did not call them in, and who paid her, besides, a sum each quarter. Eleanor put the papers down and looked at the wall for a long time. So the beautiful widow who had taken her husband's attention had not taken it at all. She had been posted to it as a sentry is posted to a gate, and paid for standing there and the whole enchantment of the last 3 years. The London evenings, the sapphire ring, the laughing supper tables where a duchess was made ridiculous about drains, had been nothing more than a device to keep a foolish man looking in one direction while another man emptied his house behind him. "He is not even the villain of his own ruin," she said aloud to nobody. "He is the mark." And she found with some surprise that she pitied him, and that the pity did not change one single thing she intended to do. Then, in the first week of October, the enemy moved twice. On the Tuesday, a letter came to the Duke from Crane, all regret, informing his Grace that the syndicate holding the mortgage would require repayment of the principal at Lady Day, and that in the absence of funds a sale of the Abbey lands would unhappily be necessary, and Julian read it at breakfast, went white, said damn it all, damn it, and rode over to Crane's house to be soothed, and came back soothed, and told his wife that Crane was arranging everything, and that there was no cause for alarm. Eleanor said nothing at all. On the Friday, an invitation was engraved and sent from Renfield itself, in Sybil's arrangement and at Julian's expense, for a musical evening at the house on the 22nd of November. The 7th anniversary of the Duke's marriage, 60 guests, an Italian tenor engaged from London, and Eleanor understood the design of it at once, because she had by then learned to read Sybil as fluently as a rent book. The county would be assembled on her wedding anniversary to be entertained by her husband's mistress in her own drawing-room, and at some point in the evening there would be some sweet public request that the Duchess perform, so that the 60 could compare a banker's daughter picking at a harp with a professional from the King's Theatre, and go home having seen, once and for all, exactly what Renfield had bought with its money. And on the Saturday, the last blow, and the one that decided everything, an agent's letter arrived at the school, addressed to Miss Finch, giving notice that the building and its grounds stood on Abbey land within the mortgage, and that in the event of sale the tenancy would not be renewed. Eleanor read that letter standing in the schoolroom with 41 children behind her chanting their sums. She had absorbed 7 years of being unheard without raising her voice once. She had absorbed a ring and a mistress and a table's laughter, but they had come for the school. That night she wrote to Adam Sinclair 4 lines. The evening of the 22nd, then. Everything, at once, before all of them. Be ready. There remained one difficulty, and it was fatal. Everything Eleanor held was a copy or a tenant's word, and against a Duke's own man of business, backed by the Duke's own signature on every authority he had ever used, copies and tenants' words could be argued away in a week by any competent attorney. She needed the original deeds. And the original deeds to the Abbey lands had gone out of the muniment room 4 years earlier, signed for by Crane, and had never come back. It was Mrs. Pratt, of all people, who solved it, standing in the still room with her hands in a bowl of quinces and saying, without looking up, that if her Grace wanted anything that had ever belonged to this family and been mislaid by the men of it, there was only one place in England to look, and that was Lady Octavia's morning room, and that if her Grace would take an old woman's advice, she would go and take her tea there and stop being proud. Lady Octavia Ashford was the late Duke's sister, 71, unmarried by choice, resident in the Dower House across the park, and in 7 years she had spoken perhaps 200 words to her nephew's wife, all of them civil and none of them warm. She received Eleanor on the Monday in a room like the inside of a clock and let her talk for a full 20 minutes without interruption. The rents, the £9,000, the syndicate, the mortgage, Sybil's debts, the school. Then she rang for more hot water and said, "You are wondering why I have never liked you." Eleanor said that she had assumed it was because she was a banker's daughter. "Certainly it was," said Lady Octavia. "I was raised to think it and I thought it, and I have watched you for 7 years and been made a fool of by my own good sense. Because in that time I have seen you mend the drains, feed the webs, sit up with the schoolmistress over her accounts, and hold your tongue while my nephew made you a joke in your own dining room. And I have concluded that the difference between blood and quality is that blood is inherited and quality has to be practiced daily, and you practice. Now my brother, who was a great deal cleverer than his son, made me a trustee of the Abbey lands in 1802, and there is a counterpart of every deed in that case behind you, and Crane does not know it exists, because Crane was never told, because my brother did not care for Crane's father either." She got up, unlocked the case, and put the papers into Eleanor's hands. "And you will want Fanshawe," she added. Sir Henry Fanshawe, attorney and magistrate at Ripon, honest as a plumb line, and he dined at this table before you were born. Send for him, and let him read the whole of it, and if he tells you it will hang together, then, my dear, you may load it and fire it, and I shall sit in the front of the room and enjoy myself very much. There was one more thing to come out before the 22nd, and it came out 4 days later in the cloister, when a letter was brought down to Sinclair among his post, and Eleanor, handing it across, read the direction, and stopped. It was addressed to Mr. Adam Sinclair Dunmore, and it was sealed with a coronet. He did not attempt to shuffle it away. He set down his rule, and stood and said, "I have been intending to tell you this for 4 months, and there has never been an hour when it would not have sounded like a man improving his position. My name is Adam Sinclair Dunmore. My father is the Earl of Dunmore, and since my brother died I am his heir, and I have practised for 11 years as a plain engineer under 2 of my 3 names. Because at 23 I discovered that a lord who dabbles is applauded for work a labourer would be dismissed for, and I found I would rather be told the truth about my drains than be flattered about them. Nobody in this county knows. My clients know a man in a brown coat." And then, before she could speak, he said, "And now I will say the second thing, since I am done with concealment. I love you, and I have loved you since July, and I am not asking you for anything, because you are another man's wife, and because you have a piece of work to finish that is more important than my feelings. When you have finished it, and when you are free, if you ever are, I will ask. Until then, I shall be your engineer and nothing else, and I shall not mention it again." Eleanor stood in the cloister with the wind moving the drawings under their weights, and found that she was, of all impossible things, laughing, one short astonished breath of it. 7 years, she said. 7 years I was invisible to a man who had every reason in the world to look at me, and the one man who ever repeated my own words back to me, to be sure he had them right, turns out to be an earl's heir in a brown coat, hiding because he wanted to be judged by his work. Mr. Dunmore, we are a very foolish pair, and we are going to be very useful to each other, and you will please not ask me anything until the 23rd of November. Then she picked up the rule, and they went back to the drains. Sir Henry Fanshawe came over from Ripon on the 5th of November, and read for 5 hours in Lady Octavia's morning room with the curtains drawn, and at the end of it he took off his spectacles and said that in 31 years on the bench he had never been handed a private case in this condition, and that he had committed men for trial on a tenth of it. He named what it was worth in law, embezzlement over 7 years, forgery in the execution of the mortgage, since the deed Crane had used bore a trustee's signature that the counterpart proved could not have been given, and conspiracy, since Lady Sybil's quarterly payments and bought debts made her a party to the design. He said the tenants' statements would carry, that Hollis's rent books would carry, that Mrs. Pratt's rescued household books were worth more than all the rest, because Crane had ordered them destroyed, and a man does not destroy what does not accuse him. And then he said the thing that decided the shape of the night. If you wish this man taken, madam, he must be taken with the papers on him, or in a place where he cannot get to them. He keeps his own memoranda in a japanned box, and he carries it. On the 22nd he will be in your house, at your husband's invitation, with that box in the carriage. Give me 2 constables in the servants' hall and a footman at the gate, and I will have both him and it before he has drunk his 2nd glass. So the last fortnight was spent in preparation as careful as an audit, and Eleanor conducted it with the calm of a woman who has stopped hoping and started arranging. The file was fair copied by Miss Finch into 3 identical bound sets, one for Fanshawe, one for Lady Octavia's own attorney, one for herself, each with its index, each cross-referenced so that a stranger could walk it end to end. Dunmore wrote to his father's London solicitors to be ready to enter a caveat against any dealing with the mortgage. 2 constables from Ripon were engaged to arrive at 7 and to sit in the servants' hall, and Mrs. Pratt, who was told exactly as much as she needed and guessed the rest, undertook to feed them and to see that nobody mentioned it above stairs. And in the middle of all of it, on a wet Thursday in the middle of November, the Duchess of Renfield did the 2 private things that mattered more to her than any of it. She went down to the school and spent the whole afternoon there, and heard every child read, and did not tell Miss Finch why she seemed so unwilling to leave, and that evening she sat down at her writing desk and wrote her husband a letter. It took her 4 hours, and filled 7 pages, and she wrote it without one word of reproach in it, because reproach was the language of a woman still asking to be answered, and she had finished asking. She wrote what she had felt at the assembly rooms at 16. She wrote about the harp, and the 7 years of listening for a step in a passage. She wrote, I do not believe you were ever cruel to me. I believe you never once looked at me, and I have come to understand that these are not so different in their effects, though they are very different in their guilt. She wrote what she had found in the accounts, and the 2 occasions on which she had tried to tell him, with the dates. And she finished, I am not leaving you for another man. Whatever they will tell you afterwards, and whatever may come to me in the years ahead, I am leaving because a person can only be unheard for so long before she begins to disappear, and I have decided that I would rather be a stranger in a small house somewhere than a ghost in a great one. I will save Renfield first. It is not for your sake. It is for the Webbs and Hollis and Miss Finch and 41 children who have nowhere else. Then she sealed it and put it in the drawer of the desk, and on the morning of the 22nd she gave Betsy her instructions that 2 trunks were to be packed and corded and put in the small carriage by 9 o'clock that evening, and that the carriage was to wait at the east door with the lamps lit. Betsy, who was 19 now and had been crying on and off for a week, asked, "Are we not coming back, Your Grace?" And Eleanor said, "No, Betsy, we are not." And Betsy said, "Then I shall pack the harp." And Eleanor sat down on the end of the bed and put her hands over her face for the first and last time in 7 years, and after a while she said, "Yes, pack the harp." The 22nd of November was cold and clear, and by 8 o'clock the drawing-room at Renfield held 60 of the county in candlelight, and the Italian tenor had sung twice, and Lady Sybil Marchmont, in grey silk with a sapphire on her hand, moved among them as though the house belonged to her, which, in a sense she did not suspect, it very nearly did. Tobias Crane stood by the fire with a glass of the Duke's claret, soft-voiced, obliging, his japanned box safe in his carriage in the stable yard, where a Ripon constable had been sitting beside it since 7:15. And the Duchess of Renfield received her guests at the door in dove grey, and thanked them for coming, and said nothing whatever about the date. It was Sybil who opened the evening's real business at 9:45, exactly as Eleanor had known she would. She clapped her hands prettily for silence and said that they had all been treated to London, and that it would be too cruel to let the evening end without hearing their hostess, who was, she understood, quite accomplished. And would her Grace not play for us? And there was that particular murmur of encouragement that a room makes when it believes it is about to watch something excruciating. Julian, from the fireplace, said, "Oh, I say, Eleanor plays a little, I believe," and half the room smiled. Eleanor Ashford rose and crossed to the harp that had been brought down from the music-room that morning by her own instruction, and sat and settled her hands and said, "Thank you, Lady Sybil. I have been playing in this house for 7 years." Then she played. She played the Handel variations her father had paid a Leeds master 4 guineas a quarter for 11 years to teach her. And she played them the way a person plays who has practised in an empty room every evening for 7 years with nobody listening, which is to say perfectly, and without any nerves whatever, because there was no one in that room whose opinion could now touch her. The candles burned. The tenor from the King's Theatre put down his glass in the middle of the first variation and did not pick it up again. And Julian Ashford, standing by his own fireplace in his own house, listened to his wife play for the first time in 7 years, and went slowly and completely white, because he was not a stupid man, only an unlistening one. And even he could hear what he was being told, that this had been in his house all along every evening at the end of the south passage, 40 feet from where he read his letters. When the last note went out of the room, nobody applauded for a full 3 seconds, and then the room came apart with it, and Sybil Marchmont's face was a study that Lady Octavia said afterwards she would have paid £500 to have painted. Eleanor stood and inclined her head and said into the noise, quite pleasantly, "Thank you. Sir Henry, I think we may go through to the library now." What happened in the library over the following hour was told and retold in that county for 30 years. Fanshawe went first, and Lady Octavia and Dunmore, and Crane was fetched by a footman who did not offer him the choice, and Julian came last with his glass still in his hand. Eleanor laid the first bound set on the table and opened it, and began. And she did not raise her voice once. She gave them the rent-skimming, Hollis's books beside Crane's summaries, page against page. She gave them the £9,000 and the bank's letter. She gave them the mortgage, and then, with Lady Octavia rising to swear to it, the counterpart deed that proved the trustee's signature on Crane's instrument had never been given. And at that, Crane stopped saying that this was an outrage, and stopped saying anything at all. She gave them Sybil's £11,000 of bought debt and the quarterly payments, and read out the marginal memorandum in Crane's own printing, and Sybil, who had come to the door of the library to see what was delaying everybody, said, "This is absurd. Julian, tell them." And Julian Ashford did not tell them anything. He was looking at the papers on the table like a man looking down into water. "She has been keeping this for 5 years," he said to nobody. "She told me twice." "Twice," said Eleanor. "The 17th of March and the 9th of November. Both dates are in the index." And she closed the book and looked at him, and gave him in the end the only thing she had left to give, which was the truth. "You are not the thief here, Julian. You are the reason the thief was safe. He robbed you for 7 years, and he was never once in danger, because the only person in England who was reading your accounts was a woman whose voice does not carry in this house." Crane was taken at 11:20, going out through the gun-room, and the constable, who had been sitting in the yard since 7:15, brought in the japanned box unopened and laid it on the library table in front of Sir Henry Fanshawe, and that box, when it was opened at the assizes in the spring, hanged the whole business as thoroughly as any document ever hanged a man in the north of England. The house emptied fast after that, 60 guests taking away 60 versions of the story, and by midnight the library held only Eleanor and her husband. And the small carriage stood at the east door with the lamps lit and 2 corded trunks, and a harp in a case strapped behind it. Julian read the 7 pages standing up, and then read them again. And Eleanor waited, because she had promised herself she would give him that much. When he raised his head, he was crying without any grace at all, the way men cry who have not done it since they were boys. He said, "I did not know." She said, "No, that is exactly what I have been telling you." He said, "Eleanor, wait. I am listening." And she said, "Yes, Julian, you are listening now. You are hearing me now, at last, because the words are leaving. That is what my voice is for, apparently. It carries beautifully at a distance." Then she set out her terms, because she was a banker's daughter and had never in her life left an account open. She would see the case through the assizes and give her evidence, and she would stay a fortnight to hand the estate to Dunmore's firm. And after that she would go, and there would be a deed of separation drawn by Fanshawe, her marriage portion restored to her own trustees, the school's ground conveyed out of the mortgaged land in perpetuity to Miss Finch and her successors, the Webbs and Hollises' tenancies secured for 21 years, Mrs. Pratt pensioned. Betsy to go with her. Julian agreed to every word of it without an argument, and then said, "Is there nothing I can do?" And she said, "Yes, learn their names. All of them, on both sides of the park, and their children. And when you know them, you will begin to be some use to this place. and you will not be doing it for me, and I will not be here to see it." And she went out through the east door and got into the carriage and did not look back at the house. And the last thing Renfield heard of its Duchess that night was the wheels on the gravel and, oddly, the faint musical shiver of a harp taking the ruts. The law worked itself out through the spring. Tobias Crane was tried at York for forgery and embezzlement. Convicted on the japanned box and Mrs. Pratt's rescued ledgers in under 4 hours and transported for life, and the syndicate's hold on Renfield was voided with the forged deed, which saved the estate, the farm, the village, and the school by 1 clear month. Lady Sybil Marchmont was never charged, Fanshawe judging the evidence of her knowledge too fine for a jury. And it did not matter in the least, because the 60 had been in the house that night, and by March no door in the north was open to her, and by June she had let the Curzon Street house and gone to live in Boulogne, where she grew older and thinner among people who admired her less each year, having taught the world her own arithmetic, that a woman is worth what she can be paid for. And Julian Ashford stayed at Renfield and did not remarry, and became by slow, painful degrees a considerably smaller and better man, a duke who could be found in wet weather standing in a ditch with Hollis learning what a culvert was, who paid the school's endowment out of his own pocket every quarter for the rest of his life, and who wrote to his former wife once a year, each 22nd of November, 1 letter which was received and read and kept and never once answered. As for Eleanor, she went first to her father's old house in York, and then, in the spring, when the trial was done and the deed of separation signed, a plain-mannered engineer in a brown coat presented himself in her father's parlour with his hat in his hands, and said, "Your Grace, on the 22nd of November I promised you I would ask a question when you were free, and Eleanor Marlowe, as she was again by then in everything but law, said, Mr. Dunmore, will you please ask it in the ordinary way and let me hear it?" And he did. And she did. They were married 2 years later, when the law had finished being slow, in the small church at Dunmore, with the Earl weeping in the front pew and Betsy holding the flowers, and it was the least fashionable wedding in the north of England that year, and there was a harp at it, and the harpist was the bride. Years afterward, visitors to the Dunmore estates would remark on 2 things: the drainage, which was the best in 3 counties, and the noise, because it was a house where somebody was always playing something, and where the Countess had a rule laid down in her own quiet voice and never once broken, that when a person in that family spoke, the room stopped. She had learned it in a music room at the end of a south passage, listening for a step that never came. Love is not the grand crossing of a ballroom floor, though that is what she built her cathedral on at 16, and it is not fine words at an altar. Love is somebody putting down their rule and saying, "Forgive me, would you say that again?" She had loved a man in silence for 7 years, and had learned, at the cost of the best of her youth, that a love which has to be shouted to be heard has already been answered, and that the answer is no. And if there is one thing to carry away from this, let it be that a woman's worth is never in being chosen, and never in being kept, but in what she knows and what she mends, and who is left better off for having stood in her light. So when a quiet person tells you something twice, hear them, because the 3rd time they will not be speaking to you. They will be saying goodbye.